help Danny with the pinning the video for Senator Warner because he wanted to be in the middle.
Pastor Michael Golden just joined us. Pastor Ralston, if you could start your video so I know that everything is working well on your end. And it will...
Yep, I'm loading it up now. Just have one little difficulty.
Okay.
It should be.
Now, Aaron, I'm looking a little funky here on, is that just my screen or do I look all right there?
Perfectly fine with your glasses.
I know, because otherwise it looks like I'm asleep. Because look at the, it's like my eyes are so half asleep. So
put your glasses on. All right, soon as I see Pastor Maxwell and Pastor Ralston video, we can go ahead and get started.
My video is already up. You don't see me because I'm not pinned on there, and I might not be in the view that you see, but I'm here. We pinned Senator Warner, so once he unpins him, I think gets you talking, you'll probably see it flow through. But Daniel's running everything from up here. I'm on there.
Well, thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. I work for Senator Warner as his outreach advisor, and thanks again for agreeing to do this. And I know that there are some live streams up. So now I would like to introduce the senior senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia, U.S. Senator Mark Warner. And after he talks, we will also like for each of the pastors to at least announce their name and their church that they're with as well to everyone that's viewing. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and good afternoon. To pastors and to the congregations who are viewing this either now live on Facebook or maybe at another time on a recorded basis. I want to thank my good friends, Bishop Brown, Pastor Ralston, Pastor Golden, and Dr. Matthews for allowing me to have this conversation at a remarkable time in our country. Like I think the vast majority of Americans, I was horrified by the brutal murder of George Floyd, and that murder coming on the tail of murders of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And then, if that was not enough, to see another killing take place with Rashard Brooks in Atlanta in the last few days. And as we start this conversation, I want to say I stand with the literally millions of Americans who are protesting under the banner of Black Lives Matter, that it is time that we see real reform in this country, that we see real criminal justice reform, that we see policing that treats all Americans fairly, and that does not end up having many communities, particularly communities of color, Black and brown communities, feeling more fear than safety when they come in contact with police officers. It's why I've joined with my friends Senator Cory Booker and Kamala Harris in putting forward what I think is the most meaningful legislation maybe ever in terms of criminal justice reform, called Justice in Policing Act. This legislation would finally prohibit some of the activities that many in the community are familiar with, whether it be chokeholds or no-knock warrants. Finally put in place an ability to monitor and make sure that those police officers who have a history of misconduct don't simply move from one police department to another, that we hold in place and are able to make sure that police officers, when they act in inappropriate ways, are held responsible under the law, and to make sure that we start the discussion to realize that in many, many circumstances in America, there may be circumstances where the best responder is not a police officer, but may be a mental health officer, it may be a social service worker, it may be someone completely different out of our governmental system, so that so many of our situations don't escalate into violence. And that is going to be one of the key components. We need to change the mindset in America that when a police officer interacts with any citizen, and that too often those interactions end up moving towards violence, moving towards pulling of firearms, and a whole series of other actions. And again, I think many of your congregations are too readily familiar with. We need to look at the fact that in America last year, 1,024 people were killed during interactions with police. Yet if you look at a country like the United Kingdom, like Britain and England, they had, I believe, 4 people killed in interactions with police last year. If you look at Japan, which is about the third of the size of America, no people were killed with interactions with police in Japan. Why so many more in our country? And I do think this Justice and Policing Act is an important and maybe one of the most significant pieces of legislation that the Senate will ever take up. We've got big choices to make in the next week or 10 days. I think this legislation, under great leaders like Bobby Scott, will pass in the House. We'll have an opportunity to debate, I hope, to debate this in the Senate. My fear is my Republican colleagues, and I have a lot of respect for Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina, but they may be putting forward legislation that doesn't go nearly as far as what my legislation does. And part of the challenge we're going to have is to make sure that we have a fair debate. And even if we start with Senator Scott's bill, we have a chance to amend it, to review it, and let the United States Senate actually do what it's supposed to do, which is legislate. But I wanted to start with that issue because I know it is on the front of minds of not only the pastors but of the congregations they serve. I also want to take a moment or two before we turn this into a dialogue and also indicate that simply dealing with criminal justice is not enough. I believe in terms of dealing with racial disparity in our country. Some of you have heard my story. I failed 3 times in business before I was successful. But I realized that if I'd not been a white man with the appropriate education, I might not have got that 3rd shot or that 2nd shot or even that 1st shot. And the promise of America is never going to be a real promise until we make sure that every American, regardless of their race or color or creed or religion or faith or who they love, they get a chance to have that same kind of equal opportunity. And what I'm concerned about, and this is an area that I have more background in, is the whole questions of economic opportunity. We've seen out of the COVID illness way more effect in Black and brown communities in Virginia and in America. For example, in Virginia right now, we only got about 8% of our state is Latino, but 50% of the current COVID cases in Virginia are with Latino families. Yet only about 1% of Latinos are in any of the vaccination trials. Again, an example of disparity in our healthcare system. And on the economic issue, the area where I hope I've got some credibility, whether it goes back to my time as governor, where I tried to make sure that the state changed its business practices to make sure we did more business with minority businesses. We are going to see, come after Labor Day, I fear a real challenge in minority business communities because so many Black-owned businesses have operated on thinner margins. Many of the COVID response plans, the PPP plan, has not been fair in terms of getting out that economic aid into Black and brown communities. And the one thing I want to commit to these pastors that is my top personal priority in the next COVID bill is to finally put money where it's needed into Black-owned banks and community development financial institutions to make sure that after Labor Day, we can shore up the economic foundations of minority businesses and those communities they serve, because otherwise, we saw in May, unemployment numbers come down a little bit, but not for Blacks. And if we don't do more on the economic front, even if we can make real progress on the criminal justice front, if we still then don't have economic equality and opportunity, we're just going to move the problem from one bucket to another. So I wanted to share again a little bit, whether it's on the economic front, the healthcare front, and on the criminal justice and policing reform front, some issues I've been working on. I thank all of these members of the clergy for the chance to have this conversation, and I'd be anxious to get your questions or comments or suggestions or criticisms of how, as your United States Senator, I can do more.
Thanks so much, Senator Warner. If we could start with Bishop Kim Brown, if you just want to introduce yourself, and then we can go around the horn and then go back and then kind of jump in if you guys have a question for the senator.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you, Senator, for just the opportunity to have dialogue. I'm Kim Brown. I pastor in Chesapeake, Virginia. September will be 30 years of pastoring the same church. And I'm also privileged in this season to be serving as the chair of the only independent hospital in the region, Chesapeake Regional Medical Center.
Thank you, Bishop.
Hello everyone. I'm Pastor Willard Maxwell. I'm also the Newport News NAACP president, and it's just an honor to be on this call with so many great leaders in the kingdom. And I thank you, Senator Warner, for having this dialogue and this discussion to talk about, the economic empowerment of minorities and also what we'll do with police reform. So I thank you so much for using your platform to promote and help our people, and the Newport News and the NAACP and New Beech Grove and all the different organizations that I serve. I speak on behalf of them to thank you. And while I'm on the phone, I do want to thank Brother Kim Brown. Thank you for what you did to help us to get here as well. And just thank you other men of God who are on this call that have been instrumental in my life. Thank you all so much. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Well, Dr. Maxwell, thank you for those comments, and thank you for your family's guidance with me for 30 plus years.
All right, thanks.
Well, all right, Senator Warner, this is Pastor Michael Golden Jr. I pastor Greater Emmanuel Temple Church of God in Christ in Hampton and in Suffolk. And we lead the International Men's Ministry of the Church of God in Christ, the largest African-American denomination in the world. And we're privileged to be among this conclave of ingenious personality as we come to discuss best practices and to see how we can all collaborate in some way to make our country much better in this season of unrest and change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pastor Golden. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator. I'm Pastor Cedric Rousen from Shekinah Kingdom Church in the beautiful city of Chesapeake, Virginia. And I'm very grateful to be on the call. I believe that this call is indicative of the principle found in Proverbs that in the multitude of counsel there is safety. And safety is one of the major concerns that we're looking for, not just physical safety, but as you have stated, economic safety toward progress for African Americans in this country, and safety on all fronts. And I think that it is in this multitude of such great counsel that we will help to strive toward it. To all of my colleagues and mentors, those who are present on the call and those whom we represent, I'm grateful to be here today.
Well, thank you, Pastor Rousen. I appreciate that. That quote from Proverbs may be the place to start us off. I mean, I gave some opening comments on some of the things I'm working on, but I would like to use this opportunity to hear from you where I should be doing more or subjects that I've not touched on. And I know this is we think COVID, with the healthcare challenges and illness and death that has brought, we think an economic meltdown, and then we think these horrific murders. As I saw recently that the stress level in the African American community is about triple what it normally has been. And I got to imagine that has put great stress on all of you as not only faith leaders, but as leaders of your congregation. I feel that stress as well, not in the same visceral way that you do. In this job, I feel I have an obligation to the 8.5 million Virginians, but I want to hear from you about where else you'd like to see me focus. So I don't know if you want to start, Bishop, again. We just go around the horn again, whatever's best for each of you.
Well, Senator, in a moment of transparency, I don't know if maybe this is the way I will start. For those of you that might not know, a few days ago, the senator called me just to literally check on me, and it was refreshing but embarrassing, simply because he asked me how I was doing, and honestly, I just started to cry. And no man really wants to show himself that vulnerable to another man, especially a United States senator. But the level of pain that I'm sure all of us are feeling was just tremendous. And what I shared with him that day is I've got a son that is a very strong black man, and in his lifetime I've seen him cry 3 times. One was a time when I challenged his faith and his belief in God, and he took it very personal and he got emotional. The second time was when we laid to rest his grandfather. And the third time was that day, about 15-20 minutes before the senator called. And the thing that kind of broke my heart is he said to me as my son, "You sold me on a nation that if I did right, everything would be okay. And I'm now starting to believe that my father sold me a lie." And that was just really rough to hear that from your son. He said, you told me as a child that if I stayed out of trouble, he said, now I realize that you didn't tell me the truth. I can literally be jogging in my neighborhood and end up being killed. And to hear a young man with 2 beautiful children that are 7 and 2 say, how do I maintain my hope that my 2-year-old son is going to ever get to the age that I am? And for the first time, I didn't have an answer. And for those of you, I think I'm the senior pastor on the Zoom. For those of you who kind of in your family have had answers for almost every situation that your family has ever had to deal with, from death to whatever other challenge, to be able to say to your children, I don't have answers for this season, was very humbling. And so I think, Senator, you've got a great start. Someone asked the other day, I was on another Zoom with Senator Tim Kaine, and someone asked, how am I feeling about the monuments being removed and things like that? And my response was simply, removing the monuments is tremendous, but until we remove the monuments that are in people's hearts, we won't see the kind of change that we really need. There's a lot of monuments that are in people's hearts. It's not the monuments that we're riding past going down the street. It's the monuments that are generationally now constructed in the hearts of people. And until we can start to remove those, I don't think real change can happen. I think this is a great start because it takes courageous conversations to move us there. So that's
Bishop, thank you. You shared that story with me, and I told before everybody got on the line, I didn't identify it. It came from Bishop Brown, but that story touched me as much as anything that made this. I've been out, seen the anger and energy, but the fact that Bishop's 36-year-old son who has been successful, great children, he is the son of one of the most incredible faith leaders in all of Hampton Roads, chairman of the independent hospital. In society's views, Bishop, you are the enormous success. But the fact that your son feels like he's not seen as any of that, he's just seen as another black man that has to be careful about the police. I can try to understand, but I can't understand.
Right.
But I know how real your emotion is. I know how real your story is. And it just, I say to you, that story, everything in that Justice and Policing Act is not perfect.
Right.
But when I heard your story, I said, I want to be the first person to be the coach march. This is not the time. This is the time to make big change. And if it's not 100% right, we come back and fix it later.
Right.
But let's make change. And thank you so much, sir, for sharing that with me.
Senator, I'll acknowledge with my colleagues on the Zoom today that one of the challenges for me in this season is next week I'm ministering from the whole paradigm of Moses and how what the system, when we look at systematic racism and oppression, sometimes what the system will do is go and find somebody that has great voice and the potential to have unusual influence, i.e. the Moses. And then it will give him a position, it'll give him protection, it'll give him promotion and provision because it realizes that's the potential way to silence the voice. And so just yesterday, I'll be honest, I'm the chair of a 2,300 employee hospital in our city. And I've been on that board since 2005. And I'm repenting because I've been on the board since 2005, which is 15 years. This is my second term as the chair of that board. And yet we've never had an African-American vice president at that hospital. That's unacceptable on my watch. And I had to face the reality that I think I might have been immune to the depths of systemic racism in our nation. And I should have called that out before now. And so I think for all of us, hopefully this is, if nothing else, a burning bush experience where we will refuse to be silent anymore.
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay, I guess I'll go. Well, first of all, Senator Warner, thank you for trusting my people to kind of run this from here. I'm just kind of using this to address the fact that I keep moving around and people are sending me text messages saying, pay attention. I'm paying attention. My team is just running this Zoom. And I would normally be where Aaron is, but I'm in here and they're getting the lighting together because, they want to be able to see me because of my pigmentation and made it a challenge without the light for where I am. So let us get into what I need to say. First of all, again, thank you for this call. And thank you, Bishop, for being so transparent and so honest because the challenge for a black man is you have dual roles. You have the voice to speak for the people, yet you try to integrate to make sure you bring other people in the conversation, and you got to speak truth to power and uplift your people, yet you have to water it down a little bit to make sure we don't alienate people like Senator Warren. So I know the challenge that you go through, and I thank you for helping me navigate through those challenges. But Senator Warner, I deal with the police all the time, so I'm not going to ask you a question about the police, but my question I have is, what type of federal legislation are you all working on? Because I know you're the guru of finance and economics, so I'm going to ask you where your strengths are. What type of federal legislation are you all working on to better empower small businesses, particularly African American and minority businesses? And can you also let people know what they can do to make sure they're able to secure some of the loans for the COVID-19? My church was able to get it because we are, we are an incorporation, but some churches weren't able to get it because they're not incorporated. So I'm just throwing it out there to make sure they need to become incorporated. But what can small businesses do? What can churches do? And also what type to get the COVID-19 relief? And also what type of legislation are you and your team working on to empower the African-American community to get a bigger piece of the American dream and a bigger piece of the pie?
Well, thank you, Dr. Maxwell, for that. And I appreciate you, going in the area that I hope I got the most knowledge about, and I do hope that back to my time as governor, I tried to make sure that words come cheap, It's what you actually get done. And we went from really crummy when I was governor to only slightly crummy about the state doing more business with black-owned businesses. We had, at that point, the most diverse administration in Virginia history. You know, being in this federal job, it's been harder. I mean, I'm not in charge the way I was as governor. But let me say 3 specific things that I'm working on right now. Number 1, any future COVID legislation, any program, I don't care whether it's a broadband program, an economic program, a healthcare program, support for state and local government program, we ought to be measuring who is getting hurt the most by COVID. If I get that data, I want a disparity study on all of the federal assistance, because I think the data will show what you already know, and that black communities and brown communities, Latino communities, are disproportionately bearing the brunt of this virus. And so that federal aid on a going forward basis needs to be directed on a percentage basis to the communities that have been hit the hardest, number 1. Number 2, on the so-called PPP program, there was $600 billion in that program. This is one of the biggest programs ever. Now, I was concerned from day one that there was not a requirement that you had to show that you were losing money, because there are a number of businesses that got this money that didn't need the money. But there is $100 billion left in this program. And what I want to make sure, and we have changed it so it's not just 501c3s, 501c6s, there are all kinds of nonprofits. Many of the churches, you know, they may still have to get incorporated, but we can help on that. And if members of your congregation or others are still trying to get access to these funds, I'd ask them to contact Aaron Carter, and we can try to help with the paperwork. Number 2. Number 3, and this is the most, I got 2 more things I want to add. This is the most important. So far, because we did the expanded unemployment, which I strongly support, let's make sure that, you know, sole proprietors, gig workers, they all get unemployment. Let's make sure people get a little extra to carry them over. That's $600 a week extra. That's all, I think, good news. But some of that's going to run out. I want to make sure we continue the expanded unemployment as long as we can. Because, you know, traditionally in Virginia, only about 30% of our workforce is even qualifies for unemployment. Yet 40% of people making under $40,000 a year, which is disproportionately black, is out of work at this point. So let's make sure if you lost a job, whether it's a W-2 job or whether it's a part-time job, you ought to be able to get unemployment. And I commit to keep working to keep that in. But the most significant thing I think I'm doing, and I mentioned this at the outset, is that the only way, let me step back for one moment. I fear that many of the largest banks, you know, the brand name banks, they may be well-intentioned, but they do not do enough business in communities of color. They do not do enough business in black communities. And so what we need, and we have lost most of our black-owned banks in Virginia, we're down to just a handful. We need to put money directly in to black-owned banks and community development financial institutions. Those institutions which by law have to at least do 60% of their lending in low-income communities. So what I've got, and I'm working actually with the administration, I've got Cory Booker working with me, I've got Mark Morial from the National Urban League. I'm trying to bring forward a whole new group of black business leaders on this. It says, let's put what's called Tier 1 equity into these banks, and then let's also go into these institutions that have lent to black businesses. And if they made those loans before March of 2020, many of those loans may now be in trouble because everybody got shut down. So I want us to do the same thing that we do for these smaller institutions that serve the black community that we did for the big banks back in 2008. If they got loans, they got to get them cleared off the balance sheet. I'm sorry so much detail here. I promise I won't keep going on, but this is important and you need to hold me accountable on it. We need to clean up their balance sheet and put more money in these institutions, because after Labor Day, if we don't, you think you've seen hardship now? After Labor Day, we are going to have a huge number of failures of businesses that have held on, but their string is going to run out. And then we also, so this investment in minority, black-owned banks and CDFIs, I think I can bring some real value here. And a lot of my colleagues, black and white, because they know I got some business background, are giving me the runway to do that. And I actually think I may even convince, I've been working on Secretary Mnuchin, and I pray for me on that. And then finally, we need to change our law. It says to any business, this is broader than just the African American community, but we need to change our laws so that a business or a hospital, Bishop, that would be willing to invest in training a human being, it's the same tax benefits they get if they invest in a robot or a piece of research and development. We got a tax and accounting and reporting system right now that is totally against people. A company can go out and buy a robot, and you get a tax credit for that robot. The robot's an asset. You can put it on a balance sheet. You can brag about it. You go out and train 2 people to be more effective in that robot, you don't get any tax break. It's viewed as a cost. Let's at least treat investment in human beings, and let's give you a bigger tax break if you invest in a poorer person. Human capital is our greatest asset. This is your business, pastors. You are much more knowledgeable about investing in humans. But we ought to have not just their faith invested in, but we need their basic net worth invested in, and we ought to have a tax code and accounting system that reflects that. Because we need to be aware that even with the investment in black banks and black businesses, there are going to be 10 to 15% of these jobs that are not going to come back after the virus. And we need to start planning for that now, not when people's unemployment runs out. And Dr. Maxwell, I want to make sure everybody gets a chance, but I would be happy. I'm going to send all the pastors my proposals in this area, and I would urge you to, both improve on my proposals, but also hold me accountable on this. Sorry to go on so long. I apologize.
Thank you so much, Senator Warner. I want to state that I've known you for quite some time, and of course, I remember watching you work with my grandfather, the late Bishop Samuel L. Green. And
who actually made the commitment and honored their commitment with those computers back in 1998?
Sir, you did. You did.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And your grandfather. I'll shut up. I'll hush up. Your grandfather was kind to me when virtually nobody was kind to me. White, black, green, yellow, whatever. Your grandfather will always have a place in my heart too.
And certainly you hold a special place in our family's heart, and so we celebrate you. He often prepared us for this moment. He was clear with us about racism and about the challenges that Black America faced. I want to celebrate you today for your push for oversight for the PPP program. I think it is essential that while there is $1 billion left, that we go back.
100 billion. Pastor, 100 billion.
100 billion left.
Yeah.
According to that statement earlier, that we go back and find out what has happened with what has already been allocated.
Yes, sir.
To ensure fairness and appropriate diversity across the board. But as we focus on the social justice component of the moment, I want to say I'm very, very proud of the package that I've seen submitted, which deals with revising federal law, banning no-knock warrants, banning chokeholds, establishing a national registry, mandating racial bias training, and making lynching a federal crime, which should have been done by now, of course, and requiring police to wear more body and dashboard cameras. I think this is essential. I think what you all are putting together is ground breaking. My concern about the moment is the climate of our politics and ensuring that the two parties can keep the rhetoric at a mature level so that we can literally get some things done. And so while I'm not really talking to a Republican leader at this point, of course you are a Democratic leader apart from the Democratic Party, a commitment from you that you're going to help the Democratic Party to keep its rhetoric, its messaging in an appropriate fashion so that we don't miss meeting the need of those who really need it. We need to keep the volume and the intensity of our politics in this moment to a level where we can really get some things done. And you've got the temperament, you've got the ability, you've shown it time and time again. You've been moderate in quite a bit of your approach, and you've shown the ability to bring the two sides together. And I think we need to see it from out here. We don't need the one-up mentality. There are some serious things that need to be dealt with in this moment. We need to reimagine policing in this moment. We need to reimagine our mental health system in this moment. We need to reimagine our criminal justice reentry process in this system. My dear brother who was shot and killed just a few days ago down in Atlanta, he was just coming out of the system. The story he tells speaks about the challenges, not just with behind prison bars, but with reentry, the limited opportunity he was given. And those same officers are going to look for a typology of him, that when they can't get jobs and they go back to the corner and do what they used to do, and then the system sucks them back in. We've got to relook at this reentry process if we can do that. And we need to also reimagine, I recommend, the restoration of rights following a felony, following spending jail time. Too many of our brothers, our African-American brothers and sisters, are not being heard where it really counts. And that's in November when we go to vote, because they have been stripped of their ability to vote. And I really believe the time is now for us to put in better processes and opportunities to make sure those that have lost their right to vote can get that right for their voice to be heard. I'll close with this. My parents believed, and my grandparents believed in corporal punishment. But once they finished disciplining me, I still had a voice. And I'm asking our leaders if they would reconsider. It's one thing to discipline me, but it's another thing to take my voice from me. And I'm asking you, Senator Warner, if you would work with us in reimagining a party that would be less sensational, and let's get some things done so that we can, of course, invoke change in our community in this season and time.
Well, Pastor, your grandfather is proud of you. And I got a couple quick comments. One, I think we need to understand, or I need to better perhaps appreciate, that struggle's never done. And I've had a lot of reflection since George Floyd was murdered. You know, I've seen about Mr. Ahmaud Arbery, you know, having the audacity simply to be jogging in a neighborhood. You know, I hadn't heard as much about Breonna Taylor until after Mr. Floyd was killed. But it made me think back. The very first law that I helped get passed when I was governor was advocated and sponsored by now Judge Ken Millman, who was then Delegate Ken Millman. And that bill was to put racial bias training in our state police. So it became law. But the one thing I think, and why this Justice and Policing Act is so important, is because you've got to not only take an action, but you then got to have a reporting mechanism, and you got to come back and review your actions on a regular basis. I think about when I was governor, I tried to extend, and I had all these executive orders saying we need to do, the state needs to do more business with minority businesses. And frankly, what happened was the kind of old guard ignored me until I made every agency head report on a weekly basis how much business they've done. Suddenly in the last year, we moved. So I think this notion you say of accountability and having that voice, I strongly support restoration of rights. We've made some progress in Virginia. There's probably more we can do, but I think we ought to do it on a national basis. I think we ought to do it on a national basis. And Michael, I would say this. I mean, we're having a debate right now, and I may need you to come up and help talk to some of my Democratic colleagues, because there is still, at this moment, when the country's heart is breaking, I don't agree with everything that Republican Senator Tim Scott got in this bill, but I'm going to give him at least the consideration that says, let's start and see how we can improve it.
Absolutely.
And simply saying, we shouldn't debate these issues is not what I think people are wanting at this moment in time. Now, they got to give us some amendments because we got to have a real debate. But I wish your voice needs to be heard in the Democratic Senate caucus, because sometimes, there is this sense that we can't get 100% of the pie, we shouldn't do anything, and that just pushes off progress. We shouldn't settle for, at this moment, we shouldn't settle for half a loaf, but we got to at least get some bread. Yeah. And if we don't act, the people won't be fed. Not to sound, I shouldn't get out of my lane, I should get back to my economic stuff and not try to sound pastoral there for a moment. I'll mess it up. But Reverend Wilson, please, you get the.
Yes, sir. So, a couple of things that were on my mind and my heart have kind of already been mentioned, and I'm grateful for that. One of which being November. Obviously, it goes almost without saying that there is such a monumental need for people to get out and vote. And one of the concerns of which that I had as well is voter suppression and the fear that there may be some types of intentional systems put in place to try to block votes in low-income areas or minority polls where there's a vast number of minorities that may be voting in several places. And so one of my concerns was about to see what things are being put in place to try to curb any attempts at voter suppression, because if we do not think that our votes will either count or will that our voting process will be fair, it's going to cause people to stay away from the polls. With that, as Pastor Golden had mentioned about seeking to do a better job in reevaluating, looking at the rights of persons, including rights of persons whose voting rights have been taken away and they have been disenfranchised for things in their past. That is a concern of mine. Another concern of mine that I had as well speaks to education and looking at, unfortunately, in our communities, sort of a school to prison pipeline. And because of SOL scores of elementary level or intermediate level children, already determining based upon those scores how many prison cells to build, and how the society, unfortunately, almost begins filtering out persons to send them on a trajectory toward prison who are not performing well in the classroom. My wife teaches in a Title I school, and to see from an educational perspective some of the disparities that schools in certain neighborhoods receive in comparison to the level of opportunities that schools in better neighborhoods receive, to me is alarming. And so those are two areas in particular that I wanted to mention that I'm very interested to see in the future how we can work together to try to help bring change. One of the, just to share my heart for a minute, one of the concerns that I have as it relates to systemic racism in our country is that anytime you find a rule, you find an exception. And what has, at least for me, been my encounter is that often you have good people who speak up for themselves as an exception. And some people attempt to speak in somewhat of a disbelief that even the racist ideology exists, and then others acknowledge it exists, but easily give themselves passes because they themselves may not embody those type of characteristics. But what I have learned is just because there's an exception doesn't mean that the rule doesn't exist. Just because there is an exception doesn't mean that the rule isn't right. And I think that what we're suggesting and what we're seeing play out in our society right now is not the absence of exceptions. The problem is about the presence of the rule, and the fact that there is an underlying rule that, as has so been eloquently stated, seems to permeate and matriculate through various sectors and mountains of society. That while on one hand we see it playing out in police brutality and in unjust police conduct, it also filters into the economic sector. Looking at felons who come out, or those who have been in prison, often finding it difficult to find jobs. The idea would be for them to start businesses, but what are the available resources, or what opportunities will they have to be able to survive as small business owners and entrepreneurs? It flows into other sectors of our society, politics, and etc. I was on a meeting yesterday, Senator, with the captain of the precinct here in Chesapeake that is closest to our church and serves the area where our church is. And in that meeting, the captain shared with us that they are down 35 officers, that they are actually short 35 officers in our precinct. And immediately the conversation began from more of an idealistic perspective about wanting to see more minorities, to see African Americans to want to pursue a career in law enforcement. And one of the realities that we had to wrestle with is that it is going to be difficult to convince people to come be a part of a solution at that level if they can't even be given the decency of respect at this level. And I'm grateful for what I've seen and heard so far about the Policing Act. One of my concerns with it is going to be that while there are some districts or precincts or some cities that have added policies, I would love to see it even increase to more of a mandated policy that is included in this training that deals with probable cause and is stating why a person has been pulled over initially before license and registration are requested. Because too often, in our case, while we talk about the extreme of criminals or those who may break the law and it's obvious that they're on the run or there's a chase, a lot of these situations that we're seeing happening are cases sometimes of mistaken identity, or a situation where there is some sense of profiling that is going on, or even assumptions where persons are being pulled over for driving a car too nice for them to be a black person. And you'll have an encounter with the police pull you over, and then the questions start getting into, so what do you do for a living? Or what does your spouse do for a living? Or what are you doing driving a car like this? Or man, and they hear, and it's only after that they take the information, and then without any justification for why they were pulled over in the first place, the officer would just say, have a nice day. I think we have to address these measures that will help disarm and de-escalate the fear and the tension by stating what the purpose is up front, and other things like that I believe from that end will help. But I wanted to highlight at least those three things, what we're going to do as it relates to curbing voter suppression, what can we do in the educational system to try to more evenly spread some sense of equity for schools that are Title I schools or schools in low-income areas, and then, of course, with the policies that are taking place for the Policing Act, what are some things that we can continue to add or include in that don't just make it to where the standard of the police's activity is subject to their personality or their personal morality or sense of ethical responsibility, but that it is mandated from a procedural standpoint where it must be followed and that consequences can come about based upon tracking of a system, that this is the way or this is a better way that that police ought to engage as the person of authority when coming into contact, again, not just in terms of these high intense moments, but these regular citizen stops that often turn a negative corner.
Yeah, Pastor, thank you for all of that. And let me try to address it. You said a lot, and let me try to address it fairly briefly. I don't think, and this is where people that look like me sometimes just needs to be better educated, to understand that notion that the driving while black pullovers happen as often as they do. Now, I know that for not because it's happened with me, but because I always travel with a young man. I've been doing this since I've been before I was governor, a traveling assistant. I've had, I think in the year since I've been governor, since I've been senator, I think I've had 11, maybe 10. Two of them were African American, 8 were, I think, one was Hispanic, I think 7 were white. Both of the African American young men were pulled over in my neighborhood once I was out of the car. Never happened to any of the white guys. So I get at least, again, I didn't have that happen to me, but at least I have
awareness,
documented proof that this is an experience that you, and I keep coming back to the bishop's comments about his son, and so I can only try to understand and appreciate. And I need to always be reminded. And I hope at least one thing I've acknowledged all the time is that, I feel very blessed to have had some business success. But I know without any doubt at all, my first business failed in 6 weeks, my second business failed in 6 months, my third one, I did really well with cell phones, but I wouldn't have gotten a third shot or a second shot or maybe even a first shot. I hadn't met a white guy with the right background. So that we can't guarantee everybody's success, but we've got to guarantee that equality of opportunity. And it's why I feel so strongly about support for black business and black bank and CDFI. We unless we're going to radically change our system, we live in capitalism. But if you don't have access to capital, you're not going to be able to participate in capitalism.
Right.
And the argument I make to people who may not agree with me is that this is not just morally the right thing to do, but we're a nation right now that's roughly 32% black and brown. You add in Asian, we're close to 40. We'll soon be a majority-minority country. If everybody in the new majority does not feel they have an economic stake in this country, then that is not a recipe for another 100 years of American history. So the policing and the difference, Pastor, the major difference, back to Pastor Golden's comments about please at least get something done. This, and I'll send you guys not only the Justice and Policing Act, but I'll send you Senator Scott's bill as well. The biggest difference between the two is that, the Democratic bill mandates a lot of changes. The Republican bill encourages a lot of changes. And and I'm going to come back to you for guidance on at what point, if we get some mix of that, do you take it, or what point do you say no? But that is core. On the education in Title I, I mean, when I was governor, and I love being governor, so it just, when I was governor, there was never a governor in Virginia history, and we had to go through a tax battle to make this happen. It finally met the state requirements for aid to public education that I met in 2005. And I think in Title I schools, we have a lot of problems, but if I could change one major challenge, it would be in Title I schools to reward teachers who stay and are successful in Title I schools. Our biggest challenge, I think, in education is we put our least experienced teachers in our most challenged Title I schools, and then if they can make it for that first 3 to 5 years, the suburban district that's, majority says, well, I'll give you an extra $10,000 to come teach in this suburban school, even if it's racially diverse, but none of these kids have got that many problems. You can make more money. And it's an easier, well, I'm not going to blame the teacher, but we have that, and excuse my language, but ass backwards. If we're looking at children that have more challenges, we should reward the teachers who are performing with those children that may be coming in with more challenges and pay them more. That's, and it's not all about pay, it's about commitment, but incent good teachers and great teachers to stay in Title I. And on the question of voter suppression, this is a big issue. I think you all know that, I was the vice chairman of the Intelligence Committee. If you look back at what the Russians tried to do interfering, their biggest set of interferences in 2016 were directed towards Black Americans.
Absolutely.
And trying to say, don't vote. And I don't want to keep coming back to the bishop's story, but, if the bishop's son, with all that he's experienced in his life, still feels like his father maybe sold him a bill of goods on fighting in this country, fighting to stay in the system. And he's even thinking about whether he should participate or not. What about your congregation member that's struggling in poverty and that child that says,
Absolutely.
I'm 18. Why in the heck should I vote in a system that's corrupt? And if you're seeing a bunch of social media, it says it's a Black Lives Matter site, and I can tell you, in 2016, the biggest Black Lives Matter site didn't come from Black Lives Matter, it came from Russia.
Right.
And they will be back. So this question, Pastor, you say about voter intimidation, I think in Virginia, we voted, we changed the legislature, we've got better laws now. We've got early voting, we've got 20 days of early voting. We've made voting election day a holiday. And I think we're going to be okay in Virginia, but what we got to worry about, what my job is to, one, make sure foreign agents don't intervene. Two, to make sure we fund the post office, because if we allow the post office to go bankrupt,
absolutely,
one, we lose about 800,000 jobs, and the ability to vote by mail goes away. And three, I've got to keep, and this is where I hope, and Pastor Golden's comments, I do have good relationships with my Republican friends, and I have and the fact that this is even a serious question, and I get this question every forum I do, what do we do about, if Mr. Trump tries to ignore the election, or tries to say, you can't come in and vote unless you've got a certificate that says you've had a COVID-19 test. There are all kinds of things in this moment of time that we could have never expected to ever happen before. And my job, particularly on this voting issue, and I hope I have I hope I have some of the respect of my Republican friends that, we cannot have this election messed with by outside interest or by a new set of rules. We may live in a period of this disease, but if you start saying, unless you're tested, we're not going to let you vote, or anything like that, our democracy is at stake. So I ask again you that if you see these signs, you let me know. But post office, Russian and foreign intervention, and trying to make sure that we, yes, keep our communities safe from COVID, but do not use this virus as an excuse to prevent people from exercising their constitutional right. So again, as somebody who's asking to get rehired this year as well, I have more than a passing interest in this issue.
Senator, one of the challenges as well, earlier you mentioned about nations, their per capita ratio of violent police outcomes. Yes, if your staff does some research, the biggest difference between their policing policies and those policing policies in America is how long and what the process is to become an officer. We've already done some research. The nations around the world that have the lowest fatality per capita police interactions are the ones where it takes at least 2 years to become a police officer. In America, it basically takes about 2 months on average to become a police officer. And so the short answer is they do a tremendously more intense process of vetting and training before you get to put a badge on. And in America, basically I can become a police officer in 2.5 months, 9 weeks, basically. And that's the biggest difference. If you look at, if your staff studies those nations that have the lowest incident of violent outcomes. Well,
Bishop, that's, I knew there was some difference. I didn't realize it was that big. And, that is something that, of course, it's that and 300 million guns on our streets.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's true too.
But I think that length of time and how we view, the professionalism of law enforcement, but that is the kind of example. That's the kind of great suggestion. Again, I don't want to keep going back to Pastor Golden's comment about how you get the parties to agree, but that could be something we could find again some common ground on.
Right.
So this has been. I'm very grateful that you were so generous with your time. I knew we were originally going to do this for a half an hour, but you get 4 pastors and a senator together. Alone in a half an hour. But before, I know we're going to close out in a minute, but I want to give a special thanks to Pastor Maxwell and his staff for doing a great job of allowing us to present ourselves. And Pastor, you look wonderful. Your staff did a great job, and you look wonderful.
I think, hey, before we close, I want to just say this one thing. I want to kind of piggyback off something that Dr. Rosen said. The police piece, and so we have all these pastors here. I know we were like, sometimes we have individuals that may be afraid to become police officer because of some things that go on in the community, or may not want to go into it because of the culture that may encourage them to do it. But I think we as pastors, with the platforms we have, we need to start encouraging our members to apply for these particular positions in law enforcement, and also get the police to come up and kind of talk about what does it take to become a police officer, in order to make sure that we have some people in place that we can be safeguarding other people with. Because if you have, if a police, this is why I do basketball, and this is why I have all these different individuals, basketball events and things, so to get together. Hold on one second. Let me close this door. Hold on. I'm sorry. It's too loud for me. So what I do is I bring them together, because if you only have an experience with the police for a bad situation, or the police only have an encounter with African Americans when they're doing an arrest, that's why we do the basketball. That's why we have the things where we have the events with the police, to begin to create some dialogue and some positive experiences that we can curate in order to make sure we bring the police and minorities together. Now, when I do the events, I always say that it's for everybody, but in the back of my mind, the main target audience are African Americans. And so what I want to tell you is, thank you for bringing up the stories you do, because people can see why it's so important. When you just said, that's powerful. If you can get your other white colleagues and non-minority friends to do those things, when you said that, some white person heard our story and received it better from you. You saying that none of your white drivers were pulled over in your neighborhood who were supposed to be there, just like the African Americans. You understand? So
Yes, sir.
it happens so much. Because I have a relationship with the police, on an NAACP president, sometimes people call on me and say, my son was pulled over. We had a prominent pastor that called me. His son had just bought a new car. I called Chief Drew because he was pulled over because he was driving while black. And I began to talk to the chief. Chief didn't understand it. He said it didn't make any sense. But one thing about our chief, he'll listen and handle the tough conversation. I say it doesn't make sense, but it makes sense to us because we know what's going on. They work the situation out. But until more people like you are bold enough to use their platform to help us, we still are going to be in the same place. So before we get off, I just want to thank you, because you thanked me for running this. I thank you as a white man in a position of power that probably does not need to do something like this, to be bold enough and probably lose a few of your white friends to come on with 4 African-American pastors and say something like that on the air. I thank you. I thank people like Bishop Brown, because if you call him Bishop Brown, I know he has your ear, so I know he's helping you make understanding. I thank you, Pastor Golden, for always being so deep, and I thank you, Rosin, for bringing all those different questions. And one other thing about the education piece, me being a former educator, if you can work it out where teachers don't get judged because of the way that the test goes, because I know I put a lot of teachers when I was a principal in challenging situations because I knew they could handle those kids. But I already knew that their test scores may not be good because of the students I put in their classrooms. But then I had to start balancing it out and maybe giving some weak teachers some of those challenging kids, because I didn't want to be unfair to them, because so many teachers are judged by the test. Testing does not test your intellect. It only tests your memory. Until we start doing things with education to raise the IQ of an individual, we will always continue to be behind, because you're getting them to remember things and not raise their intellectual ability. So that's just my 2 cents. Thank you all so much, and I'm gonna be quiet, but I had to thank you for that and thank my colleagues for being on the call.
Well, thank you all. And I owe you some documents about these bills, and I owe you some materials on what I hope to make sure we get in the next COVID bill in terms of investments in the community. And pray for the country. We're going to get through this, and thank you for this dialogue.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone. Thanks, Senator.
Thank you, Aaron.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.